Consensus. So the Washington Consensus it refers to the policies of economic liberalisation, privatisation that have effectively been forced onto what's called the developing world. So the country I lived in for longest and know best is Ghana in West Africa. I think you English call it Ghana. We call it Ghana. If Ghana... Well, the Irish Ghanaians call it Ghana. If Ghana needed access, which really pretty much every country needs access to some kind of international finance, they couldn't get it without signing up to structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs, pretty much one size fits all. Driven by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, very much in the interests of opening up the economies of the poorer parts of the world. I've worked as a consultant with the World Bank. Some people in the World Bank truly believe that actually this would be of benefit to these countries. Certainly during the period that I worked in Africa, it seemed to me much of the evidence was in the opposite direction, and more recently both the World Bank and the International Monetary Funds have looked at the period of structural adjustment, the Washington Consensus, and gone, actually, it didn't really work so well for a lot of countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So the Washington Consensus is this period where international affairs, international economic development is pretty much driven by organizations in which the vested interests of the Western countries are predominant. So again, shocking fact that this is still the case in the 21st century. During the entire history of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the sweet deal that's not written down anywhere, but it's the agreement, is that the United States administration always appoints the head of the International Monetary Fund, and the European Union always appoints the head of the World Bank. And surprise, surprise, it's the other way around. Sorry, the United States appoints the head of the World Bank, and the Europeans for the International Monetary Fund. And surprise, surprise, it's been completely, exclusively the posts held by Europeans and North Americans. And so we have a situation where the glorious diversity of human culture, the ways in which the folk in the Guarani in Brazil, the Tuareg in Mali, the Ashanti in Ghana, the Scots in Scotland, and on, the great cultural diversity that they have developed to be able to live well in their places is reduced to the common denominator of how much the GDP, the gross domestic product, the size of the economy is. And in such a way that the poor countries, culturally terribly rich, but poor countries defined in terms of money flow, are relegated to the third world, and the language kind of locks us into a way of thinking that there is best, first world, better, bad, fourth world, worst, and that they're on a trajectory to follow us, with the sole measure of their worth being GDP, money flow. So this has been the dominant story. And I'm suggesting clearly implicit in the title is my belief that this period is coming to an end. And I think there's many reasons for believing this. And as I said earlier today to folk at Schumacher College, I'm going to look particularly at Latin America, which I see as being a region filled. I'm getting winks from the Brazilians in the back row. I probably would be anyway. It's replete with really interesting, imaginative, creative new models, new ways of looking at a world beyond the dominance of the economics profession and particularly the Western model. Just before starting, the art of prediction, it's a mug's game. It's like only fools play prediction because it's almost impossible to tell the future. Partly because we almost inevitably get caught into projecting on current trends, just taking current trends into the future. So, like she couldn't possibly, how could this woman possibly have had any idea of the kind of society that was going to evolve? Because so many of the factors and drivers of the way that history moves are completely unpredictable. We simply can't see them coming. Black swan territory. And even when they could be spottable, we still tend to miss them. So I'm going to avoid the danger by refusing to make any predictions. This is not a prediction of what's going to happen. It's rather an attempt to stimulate conversation, to look at some interesting trends that I see that are not the trends, not the drivers that we're seeing reported in the media. Because it seems to me that for very good reasons, that what's being reported in the media about what's being called the Asian century, the 21st century is already being called the Asian century. You heard this? Like the idea, the rise of China, and effectively the world is going to be pretty similar to what we have at the moment, except another superpower has replaced the current superpower. Now, my feeling is, my intuition is that ain't going to be how it is, that actually far more interesting things are bubbling down that could make it a much more interesting century than simply moving from the hegemony of one superpower to the hegemony of another superpower. And that's what I want to explore. Now, this is not to say that I think this is what's going to happen. It's rather to stimulate conversation and to tell a different kind of story, because it's a theme that will recur during the talk, is that the stories that we live within are critically important. And the story we have at the moment, the dominant story, is the primacy of markets, the Richard Branson heroic entrepreneur, the onward march of capitalism. We live within stories that condition and limit the range of possibilities that we see. So what I want to do, and I'm deliberately looking on the bright side, and again, this is not because I'm denying the dark side of human nature, but it's rather that we're surrounded by dark, difficult stories that can disempower and deflate us. And so what I want to do is I want to engage in a different kind of storytelling that is opening up other possibilities. Now, these are not by no means inevitabilities, but the trends that I want to distinguish, I think, open up the possibility for a quite different way of organizing society. Just one final word of introduction is to say that like this format of me up here and you back there, rather it creates a dichotomy with me as expert and you as a passive audience. That really isn't how I see it. Given the fact of recognizing the unpredictability of future trends, I just want to reinforce that what I'm trying to do is not to put up a position that I defend, but rather to seed intelligent conversation in a different type of story. So, as I say, I want to focus in particularly in Latin America. And Latin America's encounter with the Washington Consensus dates to 9/11. That might sound like a strange thing to say. Surely it goes back a lot further than that. I'm talking about this 9/11. 9/11, 1973, the bombing of the presidential palace in Santiago, Chile, where a democratically elected government was deposed in a military coup that was supported by the United States. I think during the entirety of my conscious adult lifetime, the story of Latin America has been a story of blood-soaked dictators put in place by American administrations. So Stroessner in Paraguay, Pinochet in Chile, the Contras in Nicaragua, the list goes on and on and on. And that's been the story. So the story there is Latin America is the United States' backyard. And if anybody dares stand up, one or two somehow Cuba managed to, despite many attempts to displace the leader, managed to somehow keep independence. But the Washington Consensus was most brutally enforced in Latin America. So two news stories that have come up in the past year, astonishing. This is one. This is from The Guardian. It's actually from the Washington Post. I got it from The Guardian. This is countries that participated in the CIA's torture and rendition program. So the program So it's illegal to torture people in the United States, so they sought international partners to arrest, capture, transport suspects to countries where actually friendly countries, where torture was actually practiced. And 52 countries participated, not one of which was in Latin America. That is amazing. A second story, which is even more gleeful, is that at a certain stage it looked like the whistleblower on WikiLeaks, Edward Snowden, there was a rumor that he was going to follow Julian Assange in an application for asylum in Ecuador. And clearly what was happening behind the scene was the Americans were twisting the Ecuadorians' arms and saying, this ain't going to happen. And one of the threats that they used was that there is a regional treaty giving Latin American countries access to preferential trade access to the United States. So the president of Ecuador got up one morning, this story hadn't reached the press at all, and said, we have never had any intention of granting asylum to Edward Snowden. We unilaterally withdraw from the Trade Preference Act, and we will donate £25 million a year, which is what we estimate our benefit would have been, to human rights education in the United States. This is an act that would have been, and of course there's the Chavez experience in Venezuela, offering money to energy poor communities in the United States. I mean, it really is completely unprecedented. And this is an indicator of how things are changing. Now, let's not underestimate the continued vast military and political might of the United States. It's not to say that they're about to become a third world country. However, having said that, the US is the world's most indebted nation, with the Chinese owning many of the assets. So they're in a very, very vulnerable position. But nonetheless, most commentators looking at the 21st century are looking to China and describing, already using the term very commonly, the Asian century. And this is as a result of economic trends and demographic trends. At the center of economic power, political might will move to Asia and particularly to China. So I'm going to suggest three trends that I think taken together make that unlikely. The first, and you're going to be surprised when I introduce these, having said that I'm going to be focusing on good news stories, that actually the next bit is difficult to look at. The first trend is that anything like business as usual is completely out of the question. And in the slides that are coming, I'm going to go through these quickly. I doubt if you're going to see much that you don't already know, but the aim is putting them together in one piece so that cumulatively you can see just how impossible anything like business as usual is. So, 2006, the global economy extracted 60 billion tons of raw material from the earth. Exponential curve in terms of how much we're gouging the earth, blowing up the mountains, devastating the landscape to be able to extract the stuff that we need for an industrial consumerist economy. Shocking images. Great swathes of the planet, particularly in Southeast Asia, are being turned from this into this, palm oil plantations. Could equally be soya or corn. With this result, massive transfers of land in land grabs, where rich countries that, economically rich countries that don't have enough food, water, resource for their own people are simply buying up the best land in the poorer countries to be able to grow food for their own grow food and extract resources for their own economies. Some scientists are already talking about the age in which we're living as the Earth's sixth great extinction event, unprecedented levels of extinction. Armies in China, armies of workers pollinating by hand the orchards because the bee populations, the pollinators have been destroyed by the agricultural practices and deforestation. Industrial agriculture and industry sucking up the water in the aquifers that are non-renewable. These are fossil reserves, often taking the level of the water below the level at which villagers' wells can reach. So villagers are having to leave the land and moving into the cities. This is the River Jordan, one of many rivers that for much of the year no longer reaches the sea because of the extraction, the rate of the extraction of water. 1 billion people obese, 1 billion going to bed hungry. Growing population living in abject poverty, desperate conditions. A youth suffering from nature deficit disorder where they're better able to recognize brands than the ecosystems they inhabit. And I haven't even mentioned the big three yet. Climate change, peaking in fossil fuel reserves, and debt. This is an astonishing graph that shows these figures are they're adjusted to take inflation into account, and this by 2009, so it's not up to date. It's all the expenditure, the major expenditures that the government of the United States has ever made. World War II, Civil War, you can read these, various wars, campaigns, the New Deal, the Marshall Plan. This is the bailout of the banks in 2000, up to the end of 2009. These are claims against future wealth at a moment when growth is looking increasingly impossible. A massive carbon bubble developing where if we are to have any chance of keeping temperatures below the critical 2% threshold above pre-industrial levels, so the scientific community advising that we must keep global temperature levels no more than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels if we're to avoid tipping points being activated and us moving into climate chaos. And if we're to achieve that, somewhere in the region of 80% of the current fossil fuel reserves that could be exploited need to be left in the ground. And the share market price of the fossil fuel companies and of all the other pension funds and various other social funds that are invested in them are sitting on a monumental bubble, much bigger than the bubble that has recently burst. So I've stopped. And I'm throwing that in, like, as I say, probably there wasn't too much there that you didn't already know. There may have been one or two things. But the point is to put them all together in one place, to show that the replacement of one capitalist, Western, US-driven, US and European-driven consumerist economic model by an Asian consumerist model is completely out of the question. Do I have agreement with your body language? Does that seem a reasonable conclusion to draw? So it seems to me the first reason for disbelieving the dominant media narrative of the American 20th century being replaced by the Chinese 21st century is simply that we need a much more exciting, radical, dynamic change in behavior than merely moving from one hegemonic power to another is likely to offer. The second factor is this is the second factor that leads me to believe that more interesting things are happening is the power, creativity, and diversity of the social movements around the world that are emerging in response to the dominant neoclassical economic Washington consensus model. And again, I think for very obvious reasons, a corporate-controlled media is going to kind of mention these stories from time to time, but I think they're vastly underplaying the significance of these movements. I love this quote. This is the first half of the quote. I'm going to introduce the second half a little bit later on. It'll add layers to the story. So The source will become clear when I show the full quote. They say that disruption never comes from the centre, it always comes from the edge, from places where thinking and doing differently has greater flexibility. Perhaps it will not be the powerhouses of the industrial order where real and meaningful change comes, but from elsewhere. There's a little book that I picked up once called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And I kind of assumed when I picked it up that it was going to be, I'm Irish, by the way. I'd assumed that it was kind of going to be a bit of a funny joke book. And actually, it was a work of deep scholarship. And it was a beautifully written book. And what it did was it described the period after the fall of the Roman Empire and how the really interesting things that were happening as Rome was collapsing were happening in Munster Boyce and St Kilda and the Celtic monasteries off the west coast of Ireland. And so he was describing this beautiful period after the arrival of St Patrick among the animistic, rather warlike Celts. And something remarkable happened in the space of 2 or 3 generations where it became the period that's known as the land of saints and scholars. Where, and I spent a period working as the president of the Global Eco-Village Network and visited a lot of eco-villages around the world. And I kept on doing this, especially in Eastern Europe. I remember going to a community, an eco-village in southern Russia, and visiting the local monastery, and there was a plaque saying that it had been created in the 9th century by some Irish monk. And so what happened was, during this period, after the fall of the Roman Empire, when the libraries were being born, literates were being executed, it was a bit of a kind of a Khmer Rouge type, the European version of a Khmer Rouge, that actually what was happening in these monasteries off the west coast of Ireland was that they were keeping the flame of learning and the love of language and beautiful calligraphy. I don't know if you know the Book of Kells and the other beautiful books from this period. And really, then after the dark era, after the fall of the Roman Empire, monks from these monasteries went back out and seeded learning and knowledge and wisdom back out into the rest of Europe. So I immediately thought of that when I read this quote, that actually when empires are collapsing or when systems are dramatically in points of revolution, that very often it wasn't in Rome where the action was, it was in Iona. It was in the little Celtic communities in the periphery. And I think this is a good analogy because I think that at the moment, some of the most interesting developments that I'm seeing are not in London and Paris and Washington, but are actually on the fringes. And that's where I want to go to now. So these are the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico. I think a really important reason why Latin America is home to so many of the really interesting initiatives is because of the unbroken thread of their indigenous traditions and the indigenous wisdom giving them a thread back to stories that have been able to protect them against the consumerist story that wealth is consumption. So the concept of Pachamama, love of Mother Earth, reconnecting with the land, or not reconnecting, actually maintaining the connection with the land and finding a value in community and in closeness to the land. So the Zapatistas, how many of you have followed the stories of the Zapatistas? Are you aware of them at all? It's a popular indigenous uprising, started in 1994 where they declared war against the Mexican state, but actually what they've been doing is not so much an aggressive war as a defensive war against paramilitary sent in by the state. And what they've been doing is they've been developing very consciously, they've been kind of really seriously studying how do we manage our land well, how do we rebuild our economies, how do we respect and live well in the land that we live on. And just this year, they ran an escuelita, a little school, and about 1,700 activists from around the world were invited to go and participate in this. And one of them is a Mexican colleague called Gustavo Escobar, who will be joining the economics students by video link to explain his experience of the little school. By the way, if you want to stop me at any stage, please do. I intend to talk for somewhere in the region of an hour, leaving as long as you've got for conversation. But if you want to have conversation in between times, please stop me. The Landless Movement in Brazil, 1.25 million members last time I looked. And again, not just a protest movement, but actively engaged in a search for reviving direct participatory democracy. I mean, very much occupied territory. How do we not just protest against the ill doings of the state, but actually create communities and document and study rigorously how we can build new structures that enable us to participate directly rather than primarily as passive consumers. The seed-saving movement in India, a great friend of the college is Vandana Shiva. She's been heavily involved in this, providing a completely different narrative to the Monsanto Cargill narrative based on reclaiming the right, mass movement, reclaiming the right to what's called food sovereignty, actually retaining control over the resources, and particularly in this case seeds. I want to show a short clip of film that speaks to this.
I started with a very humble idea that seed must be saved, the seed must be free. When I heard the companies talk about owning seed and pushing GMOs, we started taking it to the villages. And in some places, people started to save seeds because they realized what it would mean if they didn't have sovereignty. In other places, there would be a drought, and the Green Revolution seeds needed irrigation, were failing them because there was no water because of the drought. And they turned to us and say, we need to save drought-tolerant seeds. In other situations, like after the tsunami in Tamil Nadu in 2004, the salt from the sea made agriculture impossible. But because we had saved rices that were tolerant to salt, which farmers in these coastal areas had bred, we could bring back the agriculture.
पहले हमारे पास जब हमने शुरू किया तब हमारे पास उस समय 60 किस्म के धान लगाए थे और 3 बीघा में लगाए हमने, ज़्यादा हमने बासमती लगाए थे। फिर उसमें हमारा मिलावट ज़्यादा हुई तब हमने ये गुच्छी निकालनी शुरू करी। ये तो अब उस टाइम 12 थे तो अब तो 300-400 और बढ़ गए तो 1500 वैरायटी हो गए होंगे हम।
Bija is what seed is. Seed is bija. Bija means that from which life arises perennially. And just when I was starting Navdanya, a woman called Bija, comes to me and says, can you give me work? And she came for domestic work. So I said, no, I can't have you for domestic work, but if you know anything about seeds, I'd love you to help me with seed saving. So she said, yeah, I used to be a farmer before I came to Dehradun. And she started talking about the crops. And I said, Bija, you're the seed keeper. And she's been there since then. Amazing, the memory not just of her own lifetime, but the lifetime of her ancestors. And then connected to teaching younger generations.
तो हर इंसान ऐसे होता है, मतलब बचपन में कहाँ होती इतनी अकल। तो हमारी दादी बोलती थी कि देखो हर चीज़ से तुम रह जाओगे पर ये अनाज से नहीं रहोगे। हर चीज़ की सबसे पहले अनाज की इज्जत करना सीखो, तो तभी तो तुम्हारा पेट भरेगा। तुम इसको फेंक दोगे तो खाओगे क्या? दादी माँ तो फिर जब आपके साल में रात अच्छा लगे था, अगले साल बोलेंगे कुछ ज़्यादा लगा, फिर रात के बीज जाए फलें ज़्यादा लगे। तो यह अभी मैं भी हमारा यह है आंसू है, तो मैं जैसे कोई बीज लगाऊँ तो उसको दूँगा, ले तो अलग गमला में लगा दे।
Most farmers are women. All seed savers are women. All seed savers. So if you have to have seed sovereignty, seed must be in women's hands. If you have to have food sovereignty, agriculture must be in women's hands. Because when women do farming, they do it for life. When women do farming, they do it for their children. They do it for nutrition, they do it for taste. When corporations breed seed, they do it for monopoly, for toxics, because they are the toxic sellers too, and for long distance trade. They do it for all the wrong things. We really are faced with two options for the future. A womanly future in which women come center stage with all the knowledge of centuries of women in farming. protect biodiversity, protect nutrition, create livelihoods, give us good food. And on the other side is a world of 5 corporations controlling the seed, destroying small farmers, destroying all artisanal production, and giving us toxic food. I don't think we should opt for a toxic future. We should opt for a living future, and that future is in the hands of women and men who are willing to be womanly.
So, something I find really encouraging is these are not just protest movements, they're movements that are beginning to develop a different type of story. This is a story of a much more feminized economy, much more protective, more circular, and in fact this the theme of taking women seriously seems to be a common theme in many of these movements. This is from the Zapatistas. They had a number of revolutionary laws they introduced. This is the women's revolutionary law. Now, there may not be too much that's revolutionary about, for example, women have the right to an education, but nonetheless to explicitly create a law, to create a law enshrining the centrality of women to the process is of great significance. And it's this, just one or two more examples. Via Campesina, largest social movement in the world. Again, a very important theme is this, the recurring theme of food sovereignty. There's a wonderful book here called Stuffed and Starved by Raj Patel, exploring developments in the food economy and particularly looking at the role of Via Campesina and the Landless Movement in Brazil in the emergence, in the creation of quite different narratives, moving way beyond protest to really explore what a people-centered, feminized economy would look like, and economy society. So, and of course, it's not just in Latin America. This is Madrid, Barcelona, one of the two. Further evidence of new stories being told. This is from a very powerful anthropologist called David Graeber. I'm just going to read it out. When thousands of people begin assembling in squares in Greece and Spain calling for real democracy, what they're effectively saying is, look, in 2008 you let the cat out of the bag. If money really is just a social construct now, a promise, a set of IOUs, and even trillions of debt can be made to vanish if sufficiently powerful players demand it, then if democracy is to mean anything, it means that everyone gets to weigh in the process of how these promises are made and renegotiated. I find this extraordinarily helpful. So the economic crisis has let the cat out of the bag. I see all sorts of new possibilities opening up, and as someone who, part of my gift is as a storyteller and kind of recognizing the power of stories, and that a lot of the reason why we've been stuck with the Washington Consensus it's been the only story in town. And I think what we're seeing now with these social movements is the emergence of different stories. This isn't a recent quote, but I think it is part of this new storytelling. Instead of the economy being embedded in social relations become embedded in the economic system. Beginning to ask the question, how would it be if we re-reverse that equation, if we began to look at how we can bring democratic control back over the orientation of the economy? This concept of the commons, it's one of those books that I'm pretty sure that it's one of those words, the commons, that were you to do a Google search and trace the use of the commons over the last 5 years, its use would have gone like that. A growing recognition that actually for much of humanity's time on Earth, the principal way that we have managed our resources, not been through the market, but through actually democratic control of over our resources, a common space. And the most powerful single storytelling that I'm seeing is from Latin America, and particularly the concept of buen vivir. Have I pronounced that right? The nearest English equivalent is well-being, but well-being doesn't really come, it's a very weak imitation of this Latin American concept of buen vivir. there's some text here saying a little bit more about it. It's tapping back into this unbroken indigenous root with a deep ancestral connection to the land that has not been broken, and drawing a wisdom from that. That has enabled, this was from the Rio, the Rio event last year, where indigenous groups in Latin America were really at the forefront of resisting further marketization. The slogan was the green economy. Really, the green economy is sustainable development Mark II. It's and the indigenous position being that rather than, for example, putting a monetary value on ecosystem services and creating a market for them, that the people who live in the places need to have democratic control over how they're used. And we're beginning to see some really interesting legal developments. And quite how we operationalize this is still a bit of a problem, not least because these economies are extractive economies. They're largely dependent on mining and other extractive activities. So exactly how these countries operationalize this is still very much in the game, but they are changing their constitution to, in fact, there's a global campaign at the minute. Polly Higgins, another big friend of the college, working to make ecocide a crime punishable in international courts. This is from the Republic of Ecuador. Their national plan is based on good living. A more famous example is Bhutan, gross national happiness. So the Kingdom of Bhutan in Asia has decided to scrap GDP, gross domestic product, and replace it with gross national happiness. So they measure the well-being and progress of the society according to these different indicators. Can you read that? Psychological health, physical health, time use, education, cultural diversity, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity, living standards. So rather than the common practice at the minute is that our prime ministers and presidents stand up once a year and say the economy last year grew by 2.7%, and the wiring that's already deeply in us because of these dominant stories is, well, everything's okay then. Whereas in Bhutan, and now also in Ecuador, they're saying, well, actually, it's not all right now. There are many things that money flows measure that actually are not relevant. They're not a good indicator of how much social wealth, ecological wealth, cultural wealth our societies have actually got. So we're going to come back to this in the final section of the presentation. So remember, I said that I think there are three reasons. There are three reasons that I see that give me not necessarily optimism, but that are really interesting and that open up the possibility for quite different future from the Asian 21st century that the media tends to carry. The first is the sheer scale of the problems that we have at the moment are such that anything that looks like what we have at the moment is simply no longer possible. The second is the creativity and vitality of these various social movements. I've got too many slides in I should have done this, I should have done this kind of thing often enough to know when I get too many slides in my presentation, but I'm afraid once again put too many in. So forgive me, I'm going to skip through a few here. And go to number 3. So there's a couple of quotes to open this. This is from Otto Sharma, who's the creator of the U theory. I'm just going to let you read that. So the general idea here being that there are structural shifts happening, driven by technology, in the heart of capitalism that are already dramatically changing, how society is organized. Just another little quote by way of introduction. Senior industrialist. I think Otto Schama is right. I think that we can overlook the degree to which this is a new thing, this kind of this growing awareness that actually there is something new that is trying to be born. This woman has got some ideas on what that something might be. This is a Venezuelan economist called Carlota Perez. And she works in a field called long wave theory, where she's looking for repeating patterns in the history of the evolution of economies. And she's particularly interested in, she is a neo-Schumpeterian. Puzzle looks in the audience. How many of you have studied economics? So Schumpeter is one of the great figures in economics who is most closely associated with the phrase creative destruction. There'll be waves of creative destruction where one way of organizing, a form of organization is simply swept away by a new technological innovation, and at the time it's happening it appears like the world is falling apart. But what then happens is new organizational forms come in and rebuild a qualitatively different economy. And so Carlota Perez, this Venezuelan economist, has identified these four have already happened. 4 waves of technical innovation. I'm not going to go through the technicalities of what the dips and valleys and peaks mean, but the core point being that at certain moments in the history of capitalism that clusters of technologies have come along, and the clusters have tended to include a communication technology and an energy technology, a new energy technology, a new communication technology that has revolutionized not only the particular sectors, the energy and communication sectors, but how society as a whole is organized. So, for example, the transition into mass production enabled by oil and automobiles it revolutionized town planning. You had the suburbs coming out. You had the rise of trade unions protecting the wages of workers so that they would be enabled to buy enough products to enable the mass production systems to be profitable. Society as a whole changed. And Carlota Perez is suggesting, and what I'm going to do with the remainder of this presentation is to look at ways in which she may be right, that the new suite of technologies, which includes renewable energy technologies, dispersed renewable energy technologies, and the internet, are at least opening the possibility for the transition from 20th century organizational forms that are centralized, top-down, pyramid-shaped, drawing power and wealth to themselves, into much more distributed, collaborative organizational forms. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, just a couple of quotes. Robin Murray is one of our teachers on the economics program. Centralized versus dispersed. This is a battle that is even more profound than that between the private and public sectors. This battle is being fought out in food, agriculture, healthcare, water, education, medicine, and above all in the finance sector. And similarly, another great, along with Carlota Perez, probably the most prominent advocate of this long wave view and seeing the potential for information technologies to usher in a much more dispersed, collaborative age is a guy called Jeremy Rifkin. I strongly recommend this book, The Third Industrial Revolution. I'm just going to let you read that. And I have to say that from my own perspective, reading these books and watching lectures on this has provided me with a language that now enables me that really everywhere I look really in society and the economy, I'm seeing this battle playing out in a way that I didn't see it before. This is not a story that is being reported in the media. But having got this language now of the 20th century centralized organizational form and the 21st century dispersed organizational form, suddenly in education, in journalism, in politics, certainly in the economy, I'm seeing it everywhere. And I just want to share some examples from a few different sectors. And then there'll be a few concluding slides and we'll move into a discussion. So the P2P Foundation is really the most important single resource for peer-to-peer collaborative initiatives. It's got about 22,000 examples, case studies of peer-to-peer collaborative initiatives, economic, social, in all spheres on the website. A strong recommendation. So we're going to look first of all at finance. The 20th century centralized model obviously has been the bank and the unitary monetary system. The 21st century form, which is in the process of being born, it remains in the margins, but it seems to me this is where the action is. Certainly, it's where a lot of the creativity and ingenuity is designing forms that enable us to bank on ourselves, to lend to each other, rather than going through the banks. So crowdfunding, I have no idea. I'm trying to read the body language to see how familiar you may be with these concepts. Crowdfunding, so using internet interface to enable people who've got money to link up with people who need it in highly creative ways. A recent breakthrough in the legislation in a number of countries now means that you can actually invest in companies. Kind of previously, in its first iteration, crowdfunding was mostly about providing small funding for cultural projects. Which was largely gift-based in exchange for rewards. We're now moving into an era, like a critical bit of legislation in a number of countries in North America and Europe, enabling people to use the internet to actually buy into companies, to invest in companies and become shareholders in the company. Kiva is it's a microcredit site enabling people around the world to invest in microcredit, small-scale entrepreneurs around the world. Enormous diversity and creativity in the creation of community currencies, multiple different forms serving different functions around the world. This is in Brixton. This is in Kenya. And schemes like this is the VEER scheme in Switzerland, created in 1934, in which small and medium companies, there are now about 62,000 small and medium companies part of the scheme, who are trading their spare capacity with each other. You go to a restaurant that's a member of the scheme. You can pay either in Swiss francs, provided you're a member of the network, you're one of the 62,000 initiatives who are part of the network. You can either pay in Swiss francs or you can pay in the VEER, the currency that they have developed. They've created themselves. And the beauty of the VEER, it is counter-cyclical, which means that in periods where the economy is very strong and there's a lot of Swiss francs in circulation, you use Swiss francs. But when there is an economic depression at the minute and not much money in circulation, the companies are able to pay each other in their own currency. And so it means that when there is economic recession, the use of the alternative currency, the VEER, increases. So, and a number of studies really, I think, pretty comprehensively demonstrating that the famed stability of the Swiss economy is at least in part attributable to the existence of the VEER. There's an annual turnover of $1.6 billion in VEER. So this isn't the solution, but it's more evidence that where the area of the economy where there's most vitality and creativity and ingenuity is tending to be at the margins, enabled by the technology. Public services. I'm just going to look at a few sectors here. Public services I find especially interesting. And I find it interesting in part because I'm of a generation that has been trained to believe that the welfare state is a universal good. And I'm no longer sure this is true. Because my reading of the human condition is that as a species we are reciprocators. And that actually if we become solely recipients and not givers, that actually this is not who we are as a species. It doesn't make us happy. And so looking at 20th century organisational forms, I would put the welfare state into the category of the large-scale, centralised organisation delivering uniform services from the centre, in which the consumer is a passive and disempowered agent. So are there different ways of doing it? And the answer is there are. Very much, we're actually going to go straight into this piece of film.
All around us, technology is helping to create new communities. New online services are providing the platforms to build trust between strangers and supporting a reinvention of old market ideas like swapping, renting, and lending. People are borrowing rarely used tools rather than buying them, swapping clothes they no longer need for new favourites, and sharing skills, like trading sushi making for French lessons. In London, tourists and commuters have made 4 million journeys using the city's shared bike scheme in less than 12 months. And garden dating agencies like Landshare have matched more than 60,000 green-fingered people with spare gardens or fellow gardeners. These ideas are part of a growing movement called collaborative consumption. So what does all this mean for the world of public services? Nesta brought together a group of leading thinkers to explore this question and show how using technology to enable trust between strangers might help reinvent our public services. The group looked at successful projects like the Good Gym, a service in London's Tower Hamlets, which pairs runners with isolated, less mobile people in their area. Every week since signing up, Ben has run 3 miles to deliver a copy of the East London Advertiser to Sarah. The Good Gym makes both people useful and directs energy from where there's a surplus to where it's needed. And it's not just runners who can help their neighbours. Civic Circle is a new service in South London which helps older people share their time and skills with others in their area. The members put in a few hours each week or month to give practical help with things like putting up shelves, digging over the garden, or setting up a Facebook page. Along the way, members meet other people in their community, reducing isolation and building resilience, which helps reduce demand on services. What works for people's time can also work for their surroundings. The UK is full of spaces that aren't being used. Camden Shares is a time bank that allows those with space to exchange it for time and skills. One of its members, the Baobab Centre, run workshops in summer and need space to house them. University College London has masses of space. Through Camden Shares, the Baobab Centre gets the space they need and in return bring a new community into the university. All these ideas depend on the power of technology to enable trust between strangers. Technology has opened up new ways of collaborating that can make use of spare capacity in communities, matching millions of haves with millions of wants. If our public services could design ways to use that spare capacity, it could provide an alternative solution to some of our most pressing social challenges. Public services could be transformed from a provider of services to an enabler of participation and social engagement. To find out more about how to enable trust between strangers, visit nesta.org.uk/collaborative consumption resources.
So I really like the last line there, which was, is it possible that we could shift public services from being the deliverer of expensive, centralised standard services to a disempowered population, and rather it become an enabler of civic participation. And it seems to me that, certainly the experience of time banking, this is a time bank scheme in Japan, where, and one of many, many examples I could give, where people who are of retirement age, but who are still perfectly able-bodied, look after people who really do need help. They're so old they can't look after themselves, and in return earn time credits. For every hour you give, you put an hour in the bank that you yourself can use when you get to that stage. But I mean, the interesting thing about schemes like this, and this is, I think the last figure that I saw in terms of participation, I think was 60,000 users of the service in Japan. It's not a fringe. In Japan it's more mainstream. The interesting thing, which doesn't at all surprise me, but it's really interesting to see it, is that when people are given a choice between the state service or this service, they go for this one. And the health, the longevity, the well-being of people participating is much greater than those who are receiving a service. And heads are nodding because it's obvious. And again, the crisis in our budgets, that even before the demographic boom, the demographic hit of the baby boomers all hitting retirement at the same time, even before that comes in, already the state is really struggling to provide service. So schemes like this are distributing intelligence to the margins throughout the system rather than having that decision-making remaining in rooms of men trying to control increasingly complex systems that are increasingly prone to crisis. Just a few more examples. I mean, these are kind of obvious. The whole open source revolution. Open source is doing for mass innovation what the assembly line did for mass production. You get the point? I could go through more sectors here, but I think probably, maybe we'll just go through this one last one. Before I move, I'll probably skip a few more slides. This is how we currently do energy. The 20th century model, power stations at the center. Large, centralized organizations pulling the power and the wealth to themselves. And a very notable feature of this particular slide is that this is conversion, transmission, and distribution losses. So hugely inefficient. This is from a report issued by the Centre for Alternative Technology called Zero Carbon Britain, which is plotting a pathway to Britain running on zero carbon emissions. And this, they suggest, is technically possible. This is how we could do it at the moment. So these are, you don't need to be able to read them, but these are all the various multiple dispersed energy forms available, which we currently have the technology to exploit. This is the distribution losses. This is a system in which buildings become mini power stations, cars become mini power stations, enabled by smart grids. Opening up the possibility for community investment in community energy resources, distributing ownership, local employment. This is the Findhorn eco-village where I spent a decade, which is a net exporter of electricity, of renewable energy, delivering the community economic resilience and a significant return because a significant part of the capital was raised in the community share issue where community members were invited to buy shares. Okay, so that's the, I'm just going to, one final sector is food. Again, I think this is a particularly interesting sector because the 20th century model Monsanto, Cargill, Walmart, Tesco. And the challenge being that even in the face of growing awareness about the importance of local food and increasingly people asking for local food, organisations buying food say, well, we'd love to buy local food, but, we just can't do it because the transaction costs of negotiating with 20 or 30 small-scale producers is too great, whereas if we just go to the supermarket and buy, it's simply much easier and cheaper. So again, a number of models emerging with at the heart of the model an interface, a web-based interface enabling dispersed producers and processors to link up easily with buyers, dramatically reducing the transaction costs and cutting out many of the links in the global value chains that don't add value. I'm not going to give any more, we could go through a lot more sectors, but we're not going to do it. That's in there just to demonstrate that this revolution is not limited to the rich countries. In the villages in Africa that I worked in, access to the internet via smartphone often is the rule rather than the exception. Okay, so the last little bit, back to this quote. They say that disruption never comes from the centre, it always comes from the edge, from places where thinking and doing differently has greater flexibility. So the second half of that quote is here. We're back to the Ecuadorian the national plan built on buen vivir, on good living. And for me, until this week, I've had three separate strands. One strand, so why will the 21st century not be the Asian century where China replaces the US? The scale, magnitude, and sheer number of crises is so great that we have to have a completely different model. Second, the popular movements, particularly in the global south. And third, the emergence of distributed systems that will enable more collaborative, dispersed ways of working. Now, in this last week, threads 2 and 3 merged with the announcement by the government of Ecuador that it is planning, so emerging out of this report that we saw previously, they've initiated a process where they're attempting to take the dispersed, distributed, commoning revolution into their national planning. So just, I suggest you just, no, not this, not that one, this one. This is a research project where they've invited Michael Bowens, who is a major proponent of commoning, to be their lead consultant. So this is a national government that is saying we are never going to be able to catch up economically with the big industrialized powers. So the route we're going to take will be explicitly to invest in education, invest in internet access to enable our citizens to draw on the collective intelligence of our citizens working collaboratively to create a better society. And this is simply the most exciting story that I have come across in years, because I think it throws open the possibility for explicitly the countries, and again looking particularly to Latin America, the countries with this very strong unbroken lineage to indigenous traditions and the earth wisdom that gives them, to embrace explicitly the potential that 21st century LinkedIn online technology offers. And where this goes, nobody knows, but to me it looks, this is where I'm looking for innovation, excitement, stuff coming from off left field. This is, I think, is where the disruption will come from. So just a couple of last slides. I love this quote. This is back to disruption coming from the margins. Just as they created out of nothing forms of protest that broke with the past, this generation is creating forms of business and commerce, literature and art that live in the cracks left by shrinking GDP and collapsing credit. This is the first generation able to treat knowledge like software, available for upload, use, upgrade, and eventual disposal. Now all they need is for the economic model to catch up with the human potential technology has created. So, just one final word is that this is not a vision of the future. It's simply what I'm trying to do is to identify interesting stories, interesting new trends that it could be that historians in 20, 30 years' time will look back and go, these were the big stories. And I hope so. And I hope that by telling the story in this way and having the story challenged and questioned and refined, that by having stories like this, that they become easier to realize. That by having the territory mapped, even if it's only a story time, even at this stage it's only an active imagination rather than observation, that by daring to point at it and say these could be important trends in shaping our future, my hope is that it may make it easier to bring it about.